And yesterday we went to Busch Gardens. It was awesome. But after everybody heat stroking with it like 98 degrees, we got a nice cold rain on all of us. A drenching like storm. They closed the park because of this storm. They closed all the rides and everything, but we were all the way at the other end of the park, so we all got to kind of hike through it and get frozen and drenched in this rain. So I was still wet when I got home after the 4 whatever hour drive to get here this morning. So that gave me kind of an instant head cold feeling thing. I feel fine. I'm just snuffly. But today, the important thing is today we are again in this mindset of instruction. So we still have the white paraments on everything in here. It is still Easter, right? So we're in this Eastertide season, and we have been in this Eastertide season thinking about the instructions of Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, right? So we had the empty tomb, and then from that point until the Pentecost moment, we had the time when Jesus gives instruction. He is no longer with them, right? So he tries to make the point to them that he's going to go to a place they can't follow. And he gives all of these instructions. Well, today on this 6th Sunday of Eastertide, we're accustomed to getting directions from our head. That is Jesus, right? On the way his body, that is us, is intended to function. But today, I'm super excited to bring, I believe, at least I thought that when I read it this week, these are the most emotive words, right? So it's the most emotional words that we hear that are instruction for what we are intended to do once Jesus goes to be with the Father. The most emotive words we hear. But they are not from Jesus. As a matter of fact, they're not really from God at all. They come through God, right? They come in a vision, but they're not from God. They're from his children. So I'd like you to listen for them in the passage that I'm going to read. This is Luke, so we take Luke as the writer of Acts and Luke, and we're pretty sure that that's true. I mean, they're meant to be almost a seamless kind of one narrative, one into the other. But today we're going to hear, and I'm going to read a little bit more than 9 through 15. I'm going to read from 6, verse 6. But this is Luke conveying the story of instruction from the early church and how God is working through this very early burgeoning church to form a people, just like he formed Israel, to form a people that would be able to pull in all of humanity. So this is Luke writing in Acts. I'm reading from 16:6 and forward. He writes it like this. Paul and his companions traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. And when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia. But the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. And so they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. And during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. And after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went on to Neapolis, a Roman colony, and the leading city of the district of Macedonia. And we stayed there for several days. And on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate down to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. And the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. And when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my home. and she persuaded us. This is God's word for us, God's precious thing, God's children. Thanks be to God. So, there's a whole lot of unusual things going on here. I never know which way to go. I just loved this. I'm not even sure where this came from, but I just love this little doll that is made out of. It just seems so precious to me, the same way that this story, I mean, it has joy, it has the color purple, which features so heavily in this, which we'll get to in a minute. I try to find an image that is something that you could look at while I'm saying things that might be evocative, and this one kind of struck my heart a little bit. So today, what we heard, right, is Luke telling us about Paul working, and Paul working at. It's interesting that when Paul gets the vision, he immediately changes to the word, or Luke immediately changes to the word we. Right? It's not Paul, it's not I, it's we go, right, at that point, which is neat. To me, it's talking about the church. It's not talking about necessarily just Paul. But we have this Luke telling this story of this burgeoning church, right, this first century church. You have all the excitement and all the craziness of new stuff happening, unpredictable stuff happening. And specifically, we have this overarching call, and we'll get back to that in a minute, but specifically we hear through one person, because that's the way stories are always told best, right? So you give this big idea about this call, right? And then you say, oh, Lydia, that's the story that's going to make this point. So that's what Luke does here. Luke's a good storyteller. So we hear this idea of this call of Paul, or we, the church, to go to these people. The story of Lydia. I need to reiterate something that I know I've already said at least once, probably multiple times. I don't remember where I say things, in Bible studies or wherever else. So I just need to make the point that when we hear something about women in the text, we have to think about it differently, right? So the text is patriarchal, and it's written in a patriarchal time. So when we understand when it was written, and if we do, we should understand that any time we hear about women in the text, that there's a reason for it. And especially like in Lydia's case, so this is a woman of a man. We're talking about a woman that has wealth that she has built on her own, right? We hear nothing of a husband, but we do hear about her, this cry that she has, that Paul and his church kind of minister to, because she has, when we think of this, think of the special nature of what Luke is trying to tell us by making this a woman, by telling us this story, right? We have to hear that when we hear this, Luke is telling us that Paul and the church is working outside of the norm, right? Not just a woman, but a woman that would invite them to stay in her home, right? And a woman that had her own wealth. So all of these, not just a woman as a character, when a woman speaks, we have to think this is written in a patriarchal time for patriarchal people. Why do we hear a woman speak? Right? There's something extra going on here. And we have to assume that Luke is making the point, right? If we listen with a careful ear here about the woman's statement, so Lydia, she's a wealthy businesswoman, a trader in this exotic dye. And I dug into this a little bit, and so purple. Right? One, it's a beautiful color. I love one of my favorite colors too. But in the ancient Near East, it was really so sought after. One, because it's beautiful, but two, because it was very scarce. And the reason it was very scarce is the way they had to produce it. Excuse me. So they didn't have all these chemical dyes we have nowadays. A chemist can come up with probably 1,000 dyes on a bench top in a day, right? But the way this dye was produced by these Mediterranean sea snails. And not the whole sea snail, but just some glands from the sea snail. And you needed thousands of these snails to make an ounce of this dye. So somebody's got to collect all these snails, and somebody has to dissect them, right? And remove the glands. And then this is combined into this lead pot, which is probably important that the lead was there, in this lead pot filled with a briny liquid that was boiled for days and days and days, which just sounds like that's going to smell awesome in any kitchen, right? But that is the reason that it's so valuable. One, because it's pretty, but mostly because it's so scarce. So when royals had purple on them, you know, it was distinctive because everybody didn't. All of us probably have purple in our wardrobe. If you don't get some purple, everybody needs purple in their life. But we all could. Not the case here. And this was the commodity of Lydia, right? So she had this. Again, words mean things in the text. So when we think about Lydia possessing this sign of power, right? We have to ascribe some of that to her, right? So by making her, or by telling the story of, I should say, Lydia, this trader in this exotic dye that's worth a ton, we're hearing echoed kind of this worth of Lydia, and this idea that she is something outside the norm, or at least I'm hearing that. But even given all that she has, right, this dealer in this commodity that the royals sought, even given this, somehow, you know, arranging all of this stuff that needs to happen to generate this dye, she ends up with this dye, which leads to her being very wealthy from what we understand, but yet she is still in need. She's still in need. So this is something else that we have to hear. There is not a possession that we can have, even snail glands, that are going to take the place of our relationship with Jesus. And so she is crying out in her own way by what she's doing, right? She's gathering at this place of prayer with other women, probably, you know, Gentile women that were observant of Jewish practices, right? Probably who they were. And Paul sees her, and Paul's intentions get rerouted. So we hear at the beginning what Paul thinks he's doing. God says, not so much, Paul. What you're going to do is go to Philippi, and you're going to find Lydia. She's going to be praying with these other Gentile women. Not really, but God steers her there. And from her need and going there, and basically asking, for this visit, and then Paul's God, who had a different idea from what Paul was going to do. All of these things come together, and Paul and this woman, in Europe, this little felt doll with her little basket of purple stuff made from snail glands, makes the first church in Europe that then explodes Christianity in the West, right? It comes charging out of the Fertile Crescent into all of the world because this little felt doll, not really, Lydia, And not just Lydia, but Paul's one. And then God working all up in the middle of it, right? But it takes both Lydia and Paul both working for God to have a way to make it work. It's not just out of the humors that God pulls this stuff. Which is amazing, right? That's an amazing story. And it's a story that can, or it should, or I should say it better inform our story, right? Lydia's story, Paul's story, God's story, because it's all three of them working up in the middle of this to start this church that moves Christianity into the West. This one event that we hear in these few verses unleashes Christianity in the West. And we better be hearing it as what our call is to do. We better be hearing it as, okay, church, I think Paul is telling us what to do here. I think Lydia is showing us what to do here. I think God is asking us to do something. God completely messed up Paul's plan and redirected him to this unexpected place and put him into the company of these people that would not normally be his target audience, right? If there was a visioning team for Paul's church, nothing against our leadership retreat, that was great. But visioning teams have their limits, right? It's not the same as a vision from God. I hope we got to hear that, right? That whatever the visioning team comes up with, it's not a vision from God, like Paul gets here. If there was a visioning team for Paul's church, they would not likely have directed Paul to Philippi and Lydia, this Gentile woman and this group of women. Gentile women would not have been Paul's first choice or his church's visioning team's first choice, very likely. But yet, these women, and specifically Lydia, unleash the gospel. Again, because she is calling, because Paul is moving, right? And because God is working. And specifically here, right? Because we're going to get to a general call in a minute. Specifically here, Lydia's calls for salvation in the middle of this. Even though it's with only one sentence from her that she speaks, we hear her call for God's hands to be not only on her, but her family and the women around her, and then for her to, in this extremely hospitable way, bring in those that are with Paul and give them a stepping stone, right, off which they might work. But I think the really evocative call, if you remember, I said that I believe that this gives us the most kind of emotional thing that we can hear as God's church, as far as telling us what we need to be doing as God's church. The most evocative call comes earlier in the passage in Paul's vision in which Paul receives a call from a Macedonian man to come help. God gives Paul a call in which he sees this call of this Macedonian man. Now, he doesn't really, it doesn't work out that way. Not quite yet, not on these terms. Paul follows this call, right? Paul follows this call, and in a way that this general call that Paul is following frames the specific call, the specific person of Lydia. Right? God works through it to reach Lydia in a way that, then grows the church in this divinely inspired way. And in this way that is not going to the people that the visioning team doesn't even know, might be our target audience. Right? Going to the unexpected. Embracing the unpredictable. But I'd propose to you today that this is the place that really requires faith. This is the place that being a Christian, being a person that would say that we follow Jesus, really requires faith. It doesn't require that much faith. I love that you guys turn up here on Sunday. You need to turn up here on Sunday. But it doesn't require that much faith to turn up here on Sunday, does it? You come into a room with a bunch of people that are fairly like-minded, Or if they're not, they go to another church because they want to hear what they want to hear, right? But you turn up into a room with like-minded Christians, mostly. We're Methodists, so we're never really of one mind, are we? But we turn up as like-minded Christians, And we get edified on the things that we believe and the things, hopefully we get pushed a little bit too. Hopefully the things we believe aren't the only thing we hear. Hopefully we get pushed on the edges a little bit. Hopefully we get made uncomfortable just a little bit, because I see that as my role, not telling you what you want to hear, but pushing you. Pushing you until you almost break and then pulling back a little bit so you don't, and then pushing hard again. I kind of see my role there. But coming here where we have a bunch of smiling faces and good music and we all kind of believe in the same things, that doesn't take that much faith, honestly. Not that it's not important. We have to come here and get, have to get edified in what we believe. We have to get juiced up to then go out and do something. But it's useless unless we go out and do something. It's useless turning up here unless we go out and do something. It doesn't require much faith to turn up here unless we take it and then go out and do something, which this church is really, really beginning to do. You see it in Paul's action today, right? Paul's interaction with Lydia. You see it in Acts 8, right? Philip's interaction with the Ethiopian eunuch. God basically sets him down there, makes him go to this Ethiopian eunuch, and then does his thing, Philip, right? And then God, pulls him up out of there, and he goes somewhere else, right? After he does what he's supposed to with the Ethiopian eunuch, after he baptizes this guy, God moves him on to some new thing. So we see it all the time, but yet the world still cries out. Jacksonville still cries out. This is something I noticed when I first came here. Wow, there's so many churches here. 3 seconds later, wow, there's so much need here. There's so many churches here, and there is so much need here. Friends, the world cries out, help. The world is continually crying out, come help. And it might be in those words, but it's probably not going to be in those words. It's not going to be in those terms, because if you think about it, a person that doesn't follow Jesus, they don't know to put it in those terms. So we can't wait around for people to ask the right thing. Oh, please come and tell me about Jesus. Please come and tell me that in my brokenness, I am not alone. Please come and tell me that in my pain, Jesus would be my companion. They don't know these. We can't wait around for them to ask us these questions. We have to be a little bit on the bold side and just assume that the world needs us. We have to assume that the world, that Jacksonville and the larger world, they need us, whether they know it or not. They need us to heal the wounds of the brokenness that they assuredly feel. They need us to go where they are, move into that space with them, and love them in that space. Which I know is a tall order. It sounds like a tall order, but this church is doing it. Not that they haven't done it before. You've done it before. But ask yourself, I know it's a tall order, but if it was you, and I can ask this in earnest because it was me. Right? Hear that. I ask this with a different way because it literally was me. I know it sounds like a tall order to assume that somebody in pain, even though they don't know how to ask you for it, needs you to come to them and love them. I know that sounds hard, but ask yourself, if it was you, wouldn't you want someone to follow the vision that God gave Paul? And this call of this Macedonian man to please come help. What he should do, doesn't tell him what his message should be, but yet cries out for one. I think friends, we have to hear this call as our call to act. We have to hear this call to as our call to get moving, this general call that we hear from Paul, this Macedonian man, come help, we have to hear it directly in our hearts. Because from what we see today, there's not much that God can do with a church that's not moving. If we're not going somewhere, God can't redirect us. Right? If we're more about committee meetings than we are about commitment to our community, there's nothing God really can do with that. God worked through Paul's actions by redirection, right? But Paul had to act to make it a possibility. Which is where then I leave you with a question. What might God do with us if we're willing to step out in faith? Even maybe not knowing where we're going. Well, we should assume we don't know where we're going to end up. As a pastor, that's just the life I live. And then when that gets changed 6 times in the process, you embrace that for whatever reason. And you do what's in front of you because we're called to that place. What might God do with us if we step out again in faith into God's vision for a church that not only meets but acts? You know, maybe it won't result in things that we expect. It might not result in the way we did things 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I kind of hope it doesn't. Because if you remember, that church was dying. Right? Losing Christians every day, that's that church. That's not helpful. Right? The gospel message, the good news is better than that. It's something we're doing to stand in the middle of it. Of course, I take on a lot of that responsibility. But maybe it won't work out in the way we expect, or maybe it won't work at all a whole lot of times, but I have faith in God that not only is with us, like Wesley would say, best of all, God is with us, talking about God's immanence, but also that God is able and God is willing to use me, and even you, use us, like in Paul's words. When Paul gets this call, he immediately switches from saying Paul to saying we. I think God is willing to use we to heal a broken world. So I'll just ask you this morning, if you want to step out in faith and see where God might bring us. Because I have a feeling it might be someplace amazing.